It is November 26th, a couple of days after the American holiday of Thanksgiving, which Americans celebrate it's either like the third or the fourth Thursday of November every year. And it really is a time for Americans to come together and learn a little bit more about each other and enjoy a big meal. This is typically what a Thanksgiving meal looks like on the table. Some squash, some apple pie, some turkey rolls. There's typically mashed potatoes, and you can see there's some gravy there. But this is, basically what a Thanksgiving spread looks like. There is some controversy around how it applies towards the founding of the country and the genocide of the Native Americans. Those of us who are very much aware of the founding of our country are not proud of that. But at the same time, what we've discovered over the years is that Thanksgiving has become the holiday where people have an opportunity to really talk about what's important in life and what's important in the world. It's an opportunity for families to get together and learn about sportsmanship. And they play football sometimes in the front yards or the backyards of their homes, or they go to the local park. And you can actually, if you were to ask any American what their favorite holiday was, I can almost guarantee that each and every one of them would say that it was Thanksgiving, because there's no gift giving involved. There's no, having to bow down to, capitalism and having to spend more money than you have in order to prove your love or appreciation for an individual. You just make some food and bring it to a community event, which usually involves family, or sometimes people go to like the local VA. Some people serve the homeless. Thanksgiving has become more than just people getting together and stuffing their faces. It's become something that I think, to be honest with you, the powers that be, or the government might actually be afraid of, because Thanksgiving is often used as a way to say, get out there and work with your community. I know in my community, there's a lot of, impoverished people that live here. There's a lot of need. There's an unending need here. Thanksgiving is a time where people come together and go to people's homes and bring food and sit down and talk to them. I see a lot of that happening in local communities. I see family members being concerned about the health of other family members and having open dialogue about why they might be feeling this way. So, and this type of behavior is what is a real threat to the powers that be. So Thanksgiving is definitely one of those holidays and one of those events that we want to keep going, because I think it really does bring community together, and it operates outside of capitalism and government overreach and all this stuff, and it really does give people an opportunity to learn things. And I think being educated and learning about what's going on in the world and being open to dialogue in a respectful, healthy manner over a nice, hot cup of cider or a nice big bowl of mashed potatoes is one of the best ways that you can help teach people or enlighten people and have open dialogue without it turning into some kind of brawl or some kind of argument like you often see on social media, where people just want to always be right about something. So Thanksgiving is a really, really good holiday for Americans. I just wanted to put that out there because today is Saturday, a couple days after Thanksgiving, and I want to move forward with my my little message today, which I'm calling getting their ducks in a row. So I want to go back to the 1997-98 issue that we had with the Gulf War veterans. What happened during this time frame, and this was brought up on November 7th, 1997. Ironically, that's the day I met my husband, was November 7th, except I met him in 2012. They brought this issue up to Congress, which is that, the 105th Congress, which is that Gulf War veterans were returning from the Gulf War, and they were experiencing various types of symptoms and sicknesses. And the VA and the Department of Defense were resisting the proof that there was strong evidence linking toxins to these chronic health effects. So veterans went and served their country. They thought they were doing the right thing. They went off to the Gulf War. They fought. They came back only to be told that whatever it was that they were feeling, which was anything from dizziness to nausea to maybe feeling a little confused, or maybe they were feeling tired, whatever, they were being told by their doctors that it was all in their head. And so many people were doing the right thing and took this to Congress and said, no, this is not in their head. And why is the VA and the DOD resisting the fact that we have strong evidence linking toxins to these chronic health issues? So they brought that up to Congress in the 105th Congress, in the 1997-98 Congress. So let's move forward to, let's move backwards to the 101st Congress. So this took place 7 or 8 years prior to this issue, where this gentleman by the name of Francis Boyle drafted an act, the 1989 Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act. And this act was to implement the Convention on the Prohibition, Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Bacteriological, which means biological, and toxic weapons and their destruction. So basically what this says is, you may not make germ warfare. You may not make biological agents or biological weapons. This was one of the most important and valuable acts that has ever been passed in history, in my opinion. The 101st United States Congress met and passed it. All right, and it was passed pretty openly. Like nobody had any issue with this proposal. They were like, yep, we shouldn't be committing germ warfare in general. All right, so this was enacted on May 22nd in this was enacted on May 22nd, 1990, prior to this. So it makes you wonder why this even happened. Why were these poor veterans allowed to experience this? Because I believe it was done under the rubric of national security, because they went off to fight on foreign land. So the toxic biological warfare, or the germ warfare that was conducted in general and possibly conducted on them, operated outside of the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act. I guess. I'm no lawyer. I'm no expert in these things, but I'm just wondering how it is that in 1997, this had to be brought up in the 105th Congress as if it was still a thing when this was passed in 1990, on May 22nd, 1990, in the 101st Congress. So it makes you wonder, it's a good thing that something like this was at least stamped into existence and is in our national archives. But, it's a good thing that it's there, but it needs to be followed. It needs to be respected. It needs to be, like, if after this point, May 22nd of 1990, biological warfare or germ warfare was found to be linked to people getting sick, like veterans, then shouldn't the provisions and the prosecutions under the law, shouldn't that be happening? These are the kinds of questions that we should be asking. And Francis Boyle brought it up to us, and Francis Boyle has been very vocal about this in the age of COVID. I'm just here to archive history. I'm just here to have a conversation about what I think is going on. I don't have any, I'm not reporting. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a journalist. I'm just a creative. So let's move on to the next thing that he was instrumental in. And this goes back to April 18th of 2002. So about 20 years ago. He was concerned, again, on the genetic alteration of pathogens for destructive purposes. Excuse me. This is the moment to outlaw all destructive applications of genetic engineering. So this man has been at the forefront from the very beginning of making sure that we do the right thing and that we don't start playing around with genetically alteration of pathogens or pathogens that could genetically alter human beings or even animals. He was very, very concerned about this. So this faculty lecture on USA biowarfare terrorism weapons was held. And I think that, and of course when I'm done here, in the description of this video, I will put each and every link so you can look at it yourself. But I thought that, here we are. How many years after this Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act, this beautiful piece of legislation, was drafted and passed by this man, Francis Boyle? Look at how many years later he still has to say, hey, wait, it's 2002. Why is this still happening? I'm very concerned about this. Let's move on. Here we are. We're coming up to date. This is, as of the publication of this, now this is from Google Books, so conclusion has been written, and my June 6, 2020 Israeli court declaration is published here below. So this is who he is. He tells you his background. He tells you all of his credentials. And then right here he says SARS-CoV-2 is a biowarfare agent to begin with. All right, so he believes what I believe, which is that the virus, what we're called is COVID, or what we're being told is COVID, or the virus, is actually germ warfare through gain of function. And I just wanted to show you very, very quickly that I did a cutesy little cartoon a while back. I actually made it before April 8th of 2022, but I reposted it on April 8th, 2022. And it's only 2 minutes long, as you can see, and it gives you a little bit of an insight into what gain of function is using a cutesy cartoon. And so some people don't believe in gain of functions, whatever. Germ warfare is germ warfare. And here's a guy who's running away. He's a lab guy, and he makes the germs. He's like in the germ warfare program, and he makes the toxins, and he's like, and he's running away. He's like, you toxins can't get me. And they're like, oh yes we can, because you made us, and you made it so that we can transmit from people to people. So I made a little cartoon about that. So let's go back to this little statement here, which I'm going to again include. But he basically talks about and calls for the closure of every biosafety level 3 and biosafety level 4 lab in the United States, if not the world. And because we know that there are labs all over the world, right, that do this kind of germ warfare, right? So one of the people that he mentions that he talked to, I was just reading about this. Just bear with me 1 minute here. I just read that I want to make sure that I get this right. Well, he had said in this long publication that I'm scrolling through, he had mentioned that one of his first conversations was with our friend, Geopolitics and Empire, otherwise known as Hervoye. And this is the gentleman right here. He's older. His name is Francis Boyle. So our good friend Hervoye interviewed Francis Boyle. So I'm going to recommend that you go and listen to this interview. Now, this is a clip from the interview because YouTube seems to think that people who write important legislation like the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, YouTube seems to think that these important people who are, lawyers or Harvard Law graduates and, writing beautiful pieces of legislation that will protect American citizens, seems to think that these people should not be heard. So what Hervoye did, also known as Geopolitics and Empire, is he took a 2-minute clip that YouTube will not take down, and he highlighted this conversation with him, and then he gives you a link on where you can watch the full interview. So I'll include this so that you can follow along yourself. Okay? So I thought that was really great that Mr. Doyle immediately said that he had spoken to our friend Hervoye, so I think that's really great. So I want you to go and read through this document and also go watch the Hervoye video as well, the conversation. So let's move on to this. So you've seen this before. I've shared this before. This is one of the biggest concerns that Mr. Doyle has, or Mr. Mr. Boyle has with the fact that the germ warfare continues, is that he sees what's happening in general is an undermining of the constitutional protections that specifically Americans have. I don't know what life is like in your country, but we have human rights and constitutional rights and protections in the United States. And so he's concerned that there's an undermining of that. And so I'll direct you to this, which I've showed before, that this Public Law Act that was passed on July 13th of 1983, or that it was amended into the Public Health Emergencies Act, basically gave authorization for appropriations to be made available to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So it transferred, basically, in a nutshell, under the rubric of a public health emergency, transferred power to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which I've talked about before in some of my other audios. Bear with me while I get some water. Okay. So this is a really important PDF, and so I'll also include it in the link as well. Now let's go over here too. This is another thing that Mr. Boyle is really concerned about. And although he didn't mention the National Conference of State Legislators, I sure have, and I mention them a lot. Because on September 24th of 2021, each state, as you can see here, amended or improved their language around quarantining and isolating people under the rubric of a public health emergency. So moving on to the next thing I want to show you is something that I've mentioned before as well, which is the key regional appointments for Health and Human Services. I've talked about this before, how these 3 key people are in charge of the various regions, and those regions make up various sections of the United States. So here's the southern region, Region 4. Here is the Eastern region, Region 3, and then down here is Region 5, which is the Midwestern region. So you're going to have these key appointments making decisions for their region. So these key appointments will be making decisions for their regions, but who will be giving them the authority to do that? Well, the president apparently gave them the authority to do that, even though usually people who are in charge of certain communities are voted into office by the community itself. But these were just appointed by a dictator, or a president in this case. So that should give everyone pause for thought. One thing that needs to be understood is, one of the reasons this is called getting their ducks in a row is because it's important that we have a continuation of the national emergency concerning the pandemic. So this was, stamped into the National Archives on February 18th of 2022. And the reason being is because the HHS is still determining that we, in fact, are a very sick country. So, Francis Boyle's concern about the undermining of, the freedom of this country is validated. It's justifiable. It seems as though freedoms are being reduced under the rubric of a public health emergency. And we have since discovered that there is a treaty in place from the World Health Organization. So back on December of 2021, the World Health Assembly agreed to launch a process to develop a historic global accord on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. This is that treaty that everyone's talking about, or that Francis Boyle talks about, and Catherine Watt talks about this treaty. And what this is the World Health Organization, the WHO, is given unlimited power. Their scope of power is far-reaching as far as how countries would take care of their citizens when it comes to their health. So the World Health Organization wants to be the end-all, be-all expert on individuals' health. So every doctor, every large-scale health hospital, like say Stanford or University of San Francisco Pacific Medical Center, or University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, or whatever big, like Kansas City Medical Centers, whatever big medical center is in your region would get instructions basically from the World Health Organization on how to treat patients when it came to pandemic preparedness and prevention. And, again, I'd like to redirect you back to the state quarantine and isolation statutes. Okay, this would absolutely have to do with this. So you need to start putting these things together. So, they launched this historic idea, this treaty, for every country to sign on to this treaty. And so far, the United States has not signed on to it, as far as I know. But just yesterday, November 25th, 2022, they held a Q&A, Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response Accord. And so they went in and they said, well, you have questions. All right, so what is meant by a convention, agreement, or other international instrument? So they basically are talking through this idea that this is kind of like, that this is considered like a treaty or a framework agreement. So framework agreements and treaties are examples of international instruments. So they talk about how it's an instrument of of care for the citizens. And then whose member states decide to create an accord? Well, member states established a process to draft and negotiate the new convention and agreement, or other international instruments. And so, I'm going to include this. I think going through and reading what they're going to do and how they're going to do it is really important. Sometimes you need to go to the people who are about ready to do things to you. They're pretty clear about what they're going to do. They're pretty transparent. So go ahead and read what they're planning on doing. I don't see anything wrong with that. So I'll include this link as well. So what are some of the things that we will see when it comes to how our lives might be changed? A lot of people say, okay, well, I'm not really seeing evidence of this kind of imprisoned life that you're talking about that will come with this kind of treaty. So what do you mean? Well, we were given example after example after example, and we were given all sorts of clues as to what we could expect. So, for instance, vaccine mandates withstand challenges as lawsuits surge across the United States. So this is from last year. People were filing a lot of lawsuits saying, hey, mandates are not law. And you can't mandate something when it's not a law. And you can't mandate something for my life when I haven't even voted on it. We don't live in tyranny. We live in a democracy. We live in freedom. So we're going to file a lawsuit. So a lot of lawsuits took place, but nothing really happened. And so that's a clue for you to say that when it comes to what's your right and your right to move freely and your right to work and your right to, to go to work and your right to have your children go to school and your right to not put a suffocation device over your face and your right to not want to get a toxic agent that has already been outlawed, you would say, well, then none of this is all in violation of my rights. And I just accidentally got rid of that screen. I'm so sorry, but I will definitely include it in the links. So we can see that all of those lawsuits that took place that didn't go anywhere are sort of a clue as to what our future might be. Another way we can see how they quarantine is how they split the kids up. Now, this is an article from 2020, from 2 years ago, ironically on my birthday, where you can see very clearly how they're splitting the kids up, right? And so it talks about how they have brought in a different kind of way that kids are going to school. So let's see. Let's read here what they've done. And I read about this too in Pennsylvania, which is the state I currently live in. So the successes of those districts that make the leap to in-person schooling are likely to encourage neighboring ones to follow suit, even as some others, most recently the Boston district, flip back into remote learning. So that flip back is really interesting. That's an interesting choice of words. That tells me that there's going to be a lot of back and forth, which is what happens when you're like incarcerated. 1 minute you're in lockdown, the next minute you're free, 1 minute you're able to go into, the common area, the next minute everybody has to move over to the cafeteria. I've never been in prison, so I don't know this, but I kind of get a feeling that there's a lot of like instructions and a lot of busy work in order to keep the prisoners from getting comfortable, right? So this is pretty much what happened with getting the kids back to school, is there was a lot of back and forth. And so what they called it is a tiered health department guideline for schools. So in a tiered system, or, like you would have, so say you have, 100 kids in school. And so say you would have 50 of those kids go to school on, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And on Wednesdays and Fridays, they would do in-school learning. And then you would have the other 50 come in on the other days. And then maybe nobody would go to school on Fridays and everybody would do in-school learning or at-home tablet learning. So, sorry. So, they would do it in tiers and they would do it in sections as opposed to just having everybody come back at once. That's very much a sort of prison-like method of existence. You know what I'm saying? So they're teaching the children that school is about, you only go to school depending on what code you are. So maybe these guys are code red and these guys are code green. And so the parents will get a little sheet that said all code red kids go to school on Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. And all code green kids go on Wednesdays and Fridays. Or maybe these guys only go on Mondays and Wednesdays, and these guys go on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then on the alternate days they will be at home learning on their tablets, but then on Friday everybody's at home because maybe that's the day they need to like wipe down the school for the pandemic or something like that to clean off the germs or whatever, you know what I'm saying, or have meetings or something. So that's what I'm talking about, is that these kinds of practices will be widely accepted because it'll just be like, okay, it's just what you do. It's just what you do. You have these different models, and some will be in school and some will be at home learning. And if you don't have anybody to watch your kid, this is what's key right here. If you don't have anybody to watch your kid, say you are a two-parent income household where both parents have to work full-time in order to, make ends meet. So you can't have your kid home alone, especially if they're young, if they're really little. That's okay. You can send them to a health-approved center where they will be with their code color, wearing a mask, and on their tablet. That's where you get your quarantine camps. All right? And then that same kind of logic may also be applied in the corporate sector. But instead of maybe going to a quarantine camp, you just have people in the corporate sector who are working from home, working remotely. All right, so a lot of what we're experiencing is already happening when it comes to these kinds of guidelines. My concern is that they actually put statutes into place for each state and for each community with penalties. There's penalties if you don't follow these statutes. So, so we've learned already over the last 2 years that lawsuits to push back against mandates don't really work. And we've already been training our kids that going into quarantine is normal. Right? So a lot of things that we're afraid of are actually already happening, and they've been happening. And we've been so subtly introduced into the very thing that Francis Boyle is concerned about, and that I'm concerned about, and you all are concerned about, which is that we have no more constitution, because everything is being done to us under the banner or the rubric of a health emergency. Now, what are some ways that we can expand into the quarantining of individuals who may be like, oh, I don't really believe in germ warfare. I don't really see evidence that people are getting sick after they've taken their fourth booster. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, then there's something called the 15-minute city. Then fine, let's just look at it from the perspective of a public and private partnership. So what is a 15-minute city? Well, it came out, years ago, long before 2021, but here's a really excellent breakdown of what a 15-minute city is on the United Nations website. It just so happens they put it under climate change, but I would argue that it's for, pandemic preparedness more likely, because the climate change language seems to be, it doesn't really seem to be going anywhere, does it? Sorry, Al Gore, but it's just not going anywhere. So here's this really great article, ironically written on my mom's birthday, February 26th. And so what we have is this idea that cities will have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody. So it sounds really good. In fact, I know people who live in 15-minute neighborhoods within larger metropolitan cities like Paris, like Chicago, like San Francisco, like New York, and they love it. They're like, I don't have to even get on a bus or a train. I can walk to the local grocery store. I can walk to my favorite cafe. I can walk to my favorite movie theater, and I can walk to my favorite little park, and I can walk to see a band. And I don't ever even have to leave it's all 15 minutes from where I live. In fact, the mayor of San Francisco himself boasted years and years ago, back when I thought that this was really cool, that no matter where you stand in the city of San Francisco, a neighborhood park with a green space, like where there's trees and maybe a little playground and you can take off your shoes and run around on the grass, is 15 minutes from everywhere you live in the city. And that's kind of amazing. So it sounds great. In fact, I know people who are like, wait, are you trying to tell me that the 15-minute city is kind of based on a prison model? Well, unfortunately, that is what I'm saying. So a number of global mayors promoted the 15-minute city in a report from this climate leadership group that was published last summer. I would again argue that they're reevaluating the whole climate narrative around a 15-minute city, and instead, because so much power and money is going into health initiatives, that they're reframing it under a COVID or a pandemic, post-pandemic or post-COVID living type of situation. So this is where everything you need, like workplace, shops, parks, schools, well, it should be within a 15-minute walk or cycle. How much easier it would be to implement those kinds of things that everybody's worried about, like digital currency, if you could do it on a small scale, bit by bit by bit by bit. So you may have a neighborhood in Chicago, for instance, where you've got the cutest boutiques, the most amazing cafes, a state-of-the-art movie theater, a wonderful center where, art exhibits take place and bands play. And maybe this whole area that's within about a 15-minute walk from your apartment, maybe they all sign up for a new kind of sort of passport currency, digitized money kind of thing. And at first, they might roll it in these tiny little neighborhoods within these larger cities, just to see how it works. They're not going to dump it all across the United States at one point. It would break the system. They need to bring it out in piecemeal, little by little by little, and not even city by city, but neighborhood by neighborhood. So that's one of the reasons why people are against these kind of 15-minute, cities, or 15-minute lifestyles or 15-minute neighborhoods, is because they're worried about, what it's going to mean to have access to any of the things that are all around. Can you imagine living within a city where you have, you're an arm's reach away from all the most wonderful things in life, but you can't access them because you didn't sign up for the digital currency method that they've all decided to adopt? What circumstances took place in 2020 and in 2021 where we got a taste of that kind of life? It was when all of the shops in my old neighborhood in San Francisco, and all of the theaters and all of the concert venues and all of the cafes told me I couldn't enter into them without showing proof of a vaccine or wearing a mask. That is how they wanted to introduce this new idea of segregating out people who don't play with, by the rules. Then they don't get access to the things that they want or need. So that happened in my old neighborhood in San Francisco. Now, since then, those mask policies and those vaccination requirement policies to enter into the facilities have all been reversed. But it doesn't matter, because they did it anyway, and they opened people up to this new kind of living, this new kind of existence, and they gave you a taste of what happens, or what's going to happen, if this, where is it? If this, sorry, where is it? If this thing right here, sorry about that. I can't even follow my own tabs. If this thing right here gets signed, I can guarantee you that that's what the future will hold. So I would say that, this is where you want to really think clearly about, making sure that pandemic treaty that's, going to be spearheaded by the World Health Organization, and every country is going to want to sign up for it, or they're going to want every country to sign up for it, that you start thinking about what that means. I was recently listening to a conversation with Michael Yaden, and he said something that JP and I have been saying all along. In the age of COVID, we have discovered more sort of freedom and sort of not really feeling the effects of the oppressive nature of the rules surrounding COVID in the neighborhood we live in. And that's in a neighborhood of deep poverty in Pittsburgh. Michael Yeadon recently said very openly, if this World Health Organization treaty goes through, you are going to have to think strongly about moving to maybe underdeveloped countries that didn't sign up for it. And he was kind of talking about colonization. He was kind of talking about colonizing poor countries, or, underdeveloped countries that simply are like, no, we're not going to sign up for this. We've seen this before, and we're not going to do it. And I already know Americans that live in bizarre places all over the world that would never sign up for something like this. And I would even argue that you could find places that would not live this kind of oppressive life and this sort of segregated life, even within your own borders, within the United States. I mean, we found it. We left San Francisco in late 2018, and then about a year later, a little over a year later, suddenly we were in the throes of fascism, and one of the most fascist cities was San Francisco, and we had sort of felt like we escaped it. We felt like refugees. So you have to start thinking about, how does a refugee think? What does it mean to be a refugee? And it's hard because refugees are not really accepted in a lot of different places. I mean, we had eggs thrown at our front door, in our neighborhood of poverty. We weren't very welcome here. It was assumed that we were here to kind of like take over, because we're a couple of San Franciscans that moved to one of the most poor neighborhoods in the country, right? So think about what that means for you, and how, if you don't want to have these kinds of practices adopted into your little community, into your 15-minute neighborhood, then start thinking of, I would say, if you know of anybody who's come out of the prison system, maybe have a conversation with them. If you know of anybody who's been disabled their whole life and been, told that they need multiple surgeries or multiple treatments, talk to them about what it means to be financialized. And this is something that I recommended people do all the way back in March of 2020. Is, get out of your comfort zone is my recommendation. First, you have to get your mind out of your comfort zone, and then you can work on, and then your body will follow suit, right? So it's a whole process. I mean, when we left San Francisco, it was a 5-year plan. We started 5 years before we even left. So we started, thinking about it and really opening our eyes to what was happening prior to leaving. There are some people that will live in these 15-minute cities, like this beautiful, little neighborhood in Paris that I'm showing you right now, that might say, but I don't feel like a prisoner. I do everything I want, and I live the way I love to live. I don't even have to worry about taking a bus or a cab anywhere. I have access to everything, and I love my safe little nook of my life, and it's really cozy and wonderful. Well, I would ask then the philosophical question: if a person doesn't feel imprisoned and they don't feel like their freedom is at stake and they don't feel like they are at risk, then are they? Just because we can diagnose fascism, as this partnership between governments and corporations to, really financialize people, and use people as kind of slaves for their benefit. But if the slave doesn't know he's a slave, doesn't accept that he's a slave, then is he a slave? He may not feel it. So is he? No, this is a real question. I'm not trying to be mean or controversial or support fascism or anything like that. What I'm saying is, each individual is going to have to come to that realization on their own. So you might find that you lose friendships. Maybe there are people who are absolutely on the right side of history, never, ever, ever going to allow a biological weapon into their body because they know that it's wrong. But other than that, maybe they're okay with living in, a 15-minute city. Maybe they're okay with signing up for a digital ID in order to have access to life. Maybe they're okay with the surveillance because they don't really feel it hurts them. I don't know. I think as this thing continues to move forward and we continue to diagnose what's happening in the age of COVID, we're going to see more splinterings and more factions of, different people with their different worldviews. And that's just the way life goes. So I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll include all of the links in today's broadcast, and I'm still working on the video essay, War Crimes, but I wanted to bring this to your attention. And just to recap very quickly, what we had back in 1997 and 98 was Gulf War veterans returning from the war, and they were very sick, but the DoD continued to resist strong evidence linking their sicknesses to toxins. And this was brought up in the 105th Congress in a session where they discussed this. Prior to that, the Biological Weapons and Anti-Terrorism Act was passed, thank goodness, but nobody seems to be following it because gain-of-function research or germ warfare or biological warfare, whatever you want to call it, is still very much in existence and still at play. We have Francis Boyle, who has been a long-standing, decades, we're talking decades, an individual who has spoken out about gain of function. In fact, he's the architect of the Biological Weapons and Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989. So he wrote something a couple of years ago within the age of COVID, which I'll include this link to the Google Books link. It's got a lot of really good information in here. I did a cutesy little cartoon a couple of years ago regarding gain of function, so take a look at that. Also, germ warfare. Some people don't believe that gain of function is even happening. You're welcome to your opinion, whatever. Germ warfare, biological warfare, gain of function, whatever. People are getting sick through the deployment of toxins by the Department of Defense, who's sort of leading this whole thing, which I've talked about before. This is Francis Boyle actually having a conversation with our good friend Hervoye, who is Geopolitics and Empire. He's running his own show here, so definitely check him out. He's been really influential in our work. Then you really want to pay attention to the 1983 language for the 1944 Public Health Service Act. So in 1983, they updated the Public Health Service Act, which was originally written in 1944, to include giving more power to health secretaries, so to the National Health Secretary. And then like clockwork during COVID, we were seeing how they were getting their ducks in a row by saying, oh, okay, yeah, so that's right. Oh, yeah, that's right. The National Health Secretary has all the power. So we states better update our quarantine and isolation statutes. And so they did that in 2021. Biden, of course, follows up in 2022 by saying, oh, yeah, that's right. All of the power goes to Health and Human Services, so I better appoint these powerful people over the regions of the country. See how they're getting their ducks in a row? And then we have on February 23rd, 2022, it was updated in the National Archives, his notice of February 18th, 2022, which says, yes, we are in a national emergency, which coincides with the October 13th, 2022 continuation of, once again, Health and Human Services saying, oh yeah, we're a really sick country. We're super sick. Why? Because I say so. And that's basically all this is. This is rule by dictator. This is not a democracy. This is not freedom. This is not safety. This is literally an announcement by a dictator. That's all this is. The World Health Organization says, I want every country to follow a World Health Protocol and a pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response system, and it's going to be spearheaded by the World Health Organization. So an assembly gets together on December 1st of 2021 and agrees to launch the process to develop it. They follow up with a question and answer question and answer period on November 25th, 2022, which was yesterday. So you can tell that they're serious. And then what are some of the ways that we have already seen quarantining and a new way of living by having your children go back to school in stages? And I would imagine that this kind of behavior, this kind of, the way people go to school in the future is going to be like this. And this reminds me of prison. And then, of course, you have the furthering of the 15-minute city language, which is that it's easier to implement digital passports, surveillance mechanisms, and control mechanisms in smaller clusters of neighborhoods. It's impossible to do it across the country all at once. So they're going to take little sections, little blocks of cities in cities like Chicago, Paris, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Austin, these really cool hip cities that we've all loved to live in. They're going to take little sections of them and start to implement what's called a 15-minute city, making it easy for individuals to never have to leave the yard. I mean, their neighborhood. So that's where we are. And I would argue that we're actually kind of already here, as opposed to it happening. And so there comes the existential question, which I will leave you with. If a prisoner doesn't feel like he is a slave or a prisoner, if he doesn't feel it, then is he?